Officer Turner sank back in his seat, scanning the quiet suburban neighborhood streets outside his patrol car window lazily. It was cool outside. The trees lining the road rustled softly. The sun was starting to set, and its long shadows were already glaring across the windscreen of the police cruiser. It was the kind of neighborhood where nothing ever seemed to happen. The lawns were always perfectly manicured, the cars in the driveways were always washed and waxed, and the houses all looked the same with identical designs. The neighborhood was too quiet and calm for Turner's liking. He preferred places with a little bit more activity. "You ever notice how these places all look the same?" Turner said, looking over at his partner, Officer Grant, who sat in the driver's seat. Grant shrugged, peering into the rearview mirror. "Guess that's what most people like. Nice, quiet, predictable." "Predictable," Turner repeated with a snort, "until someone who doesn't fit the community moves in." The crackle of the radio ended their conversation. A dispatcher's voice came through in a calm yet authoritative manner. "Unit 42. We got a suspicious vehicle call on the corner of Maple and Hawthorne. Caller reports a black female, mid-30s, sitting in a car for an extended time. She says she looks out of place and suspicious. Can you check it out?" Turner straightened up now. His interest peaked. "That's just around the corner. Suspicious vehicle in a place like this?" He clicked the button on the radio. "Unit 42 responding." As Grant pulled out onto the road, Turner's mind began to race. He had worked this beat long enough to know what kinds of calls came through in wealthy neighborhoods like these. The so-called suspicious persons were almost always people of color, just living their lives. For the residents, anything out of the ordinary, a non-white face, a car that wasn't a luxury brand, was enough to raise alarm bells for them. Turner's lip curled as he considered the call. He wondered why people who obviously knew they didn't belong somewhere always turned up in places they were not wanted. Turner glanced over at Grant, who kept watching the road, his hands firm on the wheel. Turner could tell that the new beat cop, fresh out of the academy, was still finding his sea legs. Turner had been on the force for years and was proud of knowing what an issue was going to be about before he even got to the scene. And tonight, he already knew that this was one of those nights where he'd have to use his full authority and sense of superiority. "Suspicious vehicle," Turner said, shaking his head. "Bet it's nothing, just some woman waiting for a friend or something." Grant shrugged again, and this time there was a certain tension in those shoulders. "Maybe, but we still have to check it out. Could be something more." Turner chuckled. "Yeah, right. Out of place, because she doesn't live here. That's what this is." As they approached the corner of Maple and Hawthorne, the sleek patrol car slowed down. Turner noticed the vehicle almost immediately, a black sedan parked on the side of the road. The windows were wound up, but they could make out some kind of silhouette inside. "There she is," Turner said with a tone of both disdain and anticipation. "Let's see what this is all about." Grant pulled the patrol car to a stop just behind the sedan. The street was very quiet, eerily so, with no one in sight except for the lonely car and whosoever was inside. The houses stood like silent witnesses, their windows reflecting the setting sun. But Turner knew that behind those panes of glass, a pair of eyes were watching. Someone had made that call, after all. Turner stepped out onto the drive, gravel crunching beneath his boots as he adjusted his belt. Grant followed suit, but Turner took point, his hand already hovering near his holster. He didn't anticipate trouble, but old habits died hard. He approached the car, his posture becoming increasingly aggressive as his chest puffed out and his steps slowed deliberately. "Be fast," Turner growled at Grant, who nodded but said nothing. They moved to the driver's side window where Turner rapped on the glass hard. The woman looked up with a start but didn't seem to panic. She rolled down the window, revealing a serene face set in a tumble of natural curls. Her skin was a deep, warm brown, and her brown eyes met Turner's sharply, with a calm composure that took him aback. "Good evening, officers," she said. Her voice was steady, her manners perfect. "Is there something I can help you with?" Turner didn't respond immediately. Instead, he narrowed his eyes, taking in the scene. She was alone in the car, fiddling with her purse, but altogether, there was nothing visibly suspicious. But the fact that she was here, in this neighborhood, could mean something else. She might be checking out the neighborhood for worse plans. He could certainly not put anything above people like her. "You need to step out of the car," Turner ordered, his voice cold and sharp. She blinked, furrowing her brow in confusion. "Step out of my car? Is there a problem, officer?" Grant stood restlessly at Turner's side, but Turner refused to look away from the woman. "You were reported for suspicious activity. We need you to step out of the car." The woman exhaled more slowly. Her hands stayed on the wheel. "Suspicious activity? I'm just sitting here waiting for a friend. I haven't done anything wrong." Turner was fast losing his patience. He hated people who did not respect his authority and asked too many questions. "I said step out of the car," he loudly repeated. There was a pause of silence as the woman looked from one officer to the other, weighing her next move. She looked and sounded calm, but Turner could feel the shift in the atmosphere. He had seen it before, that shift in the air before a situation quickly escalated. "I don't see why I have to get out of my car," she said, her voice still calm. "I'm not doing anything illegal. I'm waiting for a friend who lives in this neighborhood. That's all." Turner's hand inched toward his gun. "Look, lady, we got a call about you. You're in a neighborhood where you don't belong, so step out or I'll have to take this further. And I'm not sure you're going to like the next step I take." Grant could feel the sweat forming on his brows as he stood behind Turner. The tension between them was like a fog. Grant noticed that the woman's composure seemed to fire Turner's frustration. She did not acknowledge his authority, and that was more than enough to test his patience. She looked at Grant then, as if hoping to find some semblance of sanity in his eyes, but finding none, she released a soft sigh and reached for her purse, resting on the passenger seat. Turner tensed immediately, his hand instinctively tightened around his holster. "What are you doing?" he snapped. "Keep your hands where I can see them." She froze. 1 inch off the purse, her hand hovered there as she slowly turned back to face Turner. Her face was set in a firm but calm expression. "I'm just getting my ID." "I didn't ask for your ID. I told you to get out of the car," Turner snarled low. "Officer, please," she said now, her voice softer but still firm. "I don't want any trouble. I'm just trying to explain that I have every right to be here." Turner was red from anger. Who was she to speak with him like this, as if she were some kind of authority? Well, he wasn't about to put up with that. "Out of the car now!" he yelled. His voice was loud enough that it echoed down the deserted street. Her eyes flickered, but she did not move. Her stare was defiant in a silent challenge. The blood pulsed in Turner's ears. Was this woman trying to be difficult? Did she not understand what could occur if she pushed him beyond his limits? "Don't make me say it again," Turner warned, his hand still on his holster. Grant, visibly uncomfortable, tried to say something. "Maybe we should just stay out of it, Grant." Turner cut him off, his eyes focused on the woman. Grant noticed that the woman in the vehicle didn't flinch. If not for anything, she even seemed more calm. Turner's heart was racing now, threatening to burst from his chest. All he wanted now was for the woman to give him an excuse to show her who was truly in charge here. Almost as if she could read minds, the woman slowly returned her hand to the steering wheel. She exhaled a soft hiss, her tone even as ever. "I'm just waiting for a friend, officers. That's all." But Turner wasn't listening. His mind was already made up. She didn't belong here, and she was going to learn a bitter lesson tonight. "What's your name, lady?" Turner spat. "Brianna," she calmly replied, her hands still on the steering wheel. Officer Turner stood with his hand hovering near his holster, with Grant a few steps behind him. Grant looked clearly unsure of what to do next. Turner was taking the lead, and Grant wasn't about to contradict his more experienced partner, especially not in front of a civilian. But he couldn't deny the feeling of unease that was settling in his stomach. Brianna sat behind the wheel of the black sedan, hands firmly on the steering wheel, eyes calm but alert. She'd gone through this before. It wasn't the same situation, but the same energy, the same assumptions. She was, after all, a black woman in America, and one who had risen through the ranks of the FBI. She had to prove her worth twice, once as a woman and another as a black person. But one thing she had learned from encounters like this was always to keep her cool. Throwing a fit wasn't going to do her any good. Staying calm and composed was her best defense, even though inside, she could feel her heart go racing. This quiet suburban street felt like a stage, with houses looming in the background, their windows a reflection of the setting sun. Brianna could see the eyes peering behind silk curtains. If not for anything, Turner's voice, shouting orders at her, should have attracted their attention. She knew that behind those curtains, one of them had called the cops on her, assuming that her being here and her existence within this neighborhood were suspicious. She swallowed the anger that bubbled up in her throat and focused on the situation with the officers. Brianna knew she had to find a way to de-escalate the situation before it spiraled out of control, but she wasn't going to do it in a way that belittled her or her position. Turner knocked on the window again, this time a little harder since his patience was running thin. "I'm not going to ask you again. Get out of the car." Brianna didn't flinch at the harshness in his voice, continuing to stare at him. "Officer, with all due respect, I'm not sure why you are asking me to get out of my vehicle. I am just sitting here waiting for a friend. I have done nothing wrong." Turner's face hardened. "We got a call about a suspicious person, and here you are, parked in a car that doesn't belong in this neighborhood. That's enough for reason for me to ask you to step out of the vehicle." Brianna cocked an eyebrow at the officer's words. A car that doesn't belong? And what exactly about my car or me doesn't belong here? It was a quiet challenge hanging in the air, one Turner wasn't prepared for. He was not used to being questioned in this manner, most definitely not by a black lady who he knew couldn't be up to anything good. His teeth clenched as his frustration got worse. This woman wasn't cooperating, which just looked bad for him. She should have long stepped out and apologized, allowing them to handle the situation, he thought. Now, she was defying him, making him feel like he was losing control. "I don't want to hear your excuses," Turner barked, advancing to the car. "You're acting suspiciously, and you need to get out of the vehicle. Now." Slowly, Brianna exhaled, reining her emotion in. Time in the FBI had trained her for moments like this. Moments when in an instant, a situation could turn bad, where one wrong word or one wrong move might make a tense moment dangerous. She knew yelling or jerky movements just might do that to these officers. She remained still with her hands visible and a calm voice. "Officer, I've told you I am waiting for a friend who lives in this neighborhood. I have sat here less than a quarter of an hour. There is nothing suspicious about what I'm doing." Grant looked uncomfortably beside Turner, placing his hand on his belt but not reaching for his weapon. He glanced at Brianna and then his partner. "Maybe we should just ask her for ID," Grant suggested. Turner shot him a glare. "I told her to get out of the car. and that's what she's going to do." Brianna's eyes flashed from one officer to the other. She understood what was happening. Turner was running the show, driven by ego and command. Grant was the lackey, hesitant but taking orders. She could manipulate that to her benefit, but the tightrope she would have to walk would be razor thin. "Officer," Brianna said now, addressing Grant directly, "I don't have a problem showing you my ID if that is what it is going to take for this whole thing to sort itself out. I'd like to stay in my car, though. I really just don't see the need to get out, seeing that I haven't committed any offense." Grant seemed to weigh his options, his mind tinkering with what to do or say. Brianna could literally see the hesitation in his eyes. He was not like the other officer, but before he could respond, Turner cut him off. "I don't care if you show your ID or not," Turner barked again, his voice rising anew. "You're in a place where you don't belong, and you're refusing to follow orders. Now, are you going to get out of the car, or am I going to have to pull you out?" Brianna felt the menace in his tone and immediately knew he was not joking. She felt her pulse rise. Brianna knew too well about aggressive officers, but this was different. Turner wasn't acting on authority, but as a man searching for a fight, it was as if he was trying to see just how far she would tolerate him before lashing out or doing something stupid. But that wasn't a satisfaction he was going to get from Brianna. Brianna looked him in the eye, her voice calm but firm. "Officer, I am not refusing to follow orders. What I am doing is asking why I need to step out of my vehicle when I have done nothing wrong. You have given no reason to suspect me of a crime." Turner's face reddened, his frustration boiling over. He leaned in closer, his face just inches from Brianna's window, his hand now fully resting on the butt of his gun. "I'm not going to argue with you. Get out of the car, or we'll do this the hard way." The threat hung in the air, a loaded weapon, and for a second, Brianna considered the options open to her. She could get out of the car, just do as he wanted, and hope that would de-escalate the situation. But her instincts knew that this wasn't just about her stepping out. Turner wanted control. He thrived on absolute unquestioning compliance, and even if she did what he said right now, it would not end there. She turned back to Grant, searching his face for some semblance of sanity, but he had nothing to say, refusing to even meet her gaze. The clear implication hung in the air. Turner was in charge, and Grant wasn't about to intervene. Things were balancing dangerously on the cusp of something bad, something dangerous, and Brianna knew she needed to step with extreme care. Her training took over. She took a deep breath, her movements slow and deliberate. "I understand that you're responding to a call, and I'm willing to cooperate, but I need you to understand that I've done nothing wrong. I'm waiting for a friend, and that's all." Turner didn't budge, his eyes fixed on hers, a silent dare for her to defy him again. He was used to getting his way, used to people cowering down when he came at them with aggression. But not only wasn't Brianna cowering, she seemed infuriatingly different from them. "Last chance," he growled. "Step out, or I'll make you." It was a situation that had escalated far quicker than Brianna had anticipated, and she felt the weight of Turner's authority pressing down on her. She could feel the danger there, the thin line she walked, and yet she knew something Turner didn't. She had a card to play, one which would balance the scales in an instant. She spoke carefully now. "Officer, I'd like to reach into my bag now and show you something that might help clear this up. I'm not making any sudden movements. I just want to show you my identification." Turner's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "What's in the bag?" "My ID," Brianna replied, her voice steady. "I'd like you to see it." For a long moment, Turner didn't move. His eyes locked on hers as he plainly debated whether to trust her. His hand remained near his gun, his gaze darting between Brianna and the bag on her passenger seat. He didn't like not being in control, and at this very moment she was dictating the speed of the interaction. Slowly, he stepped back. "All right, slowly." Brianna nodded and, with deliberate, slow motions, reached for her shoulder bag. Turner watched her like a hawk, all his muscles coiled and ready to spring into action at the first sight of trouble. Grant stood some feet away, his silence covered behind an impenetrable mask. With smooth deliberation, Brianna opened her handbag and slid her hand inside. She could feel Turner staring at her, his frustration blistering the air off his body. But she didn't rush. She knew this was one of those moments. Her fingers wrapped around the cool metal of her badge. She drew it out slowly, holding it up so that both officers could see the unmistakable gleam of the FBI emblem. For a second, there was only complete and utter silence. It was almost like even the neighborhood had let out a gasp at what came out of the bag. The eyes of Turner expanded in their sockets as Grant's mouth fell open. At that very moment, the balance of power shifted. Brianna's voice did not rise, but there was a new edge of command in her tone now. "Officers, I think you might want to reconsider your approach." The silence drew out while the weight of what they were seeing set in. The badge glinted brightly in the glowing light. What it meant and its implications was like a gut punch to the two officers. Turner blinked twice as his brain tried to balance what he was seeing against the assumptions he'd made only seconds before. Grant didn't move. The blood had drained from his face. He could swear that time had paused, but the leaves rustling by the sidewalk showed him it was just the shock of the moment. Brianna held the badge tightly in her hand. She knew the power behind it, not only in its authority, but also in how it completely flipped whatever assumptions the officers had made. It wasn't just the badge, but what it symbolized. This woman they had approached so aggressively and suspiciously, barking orders at, was more than some civilian to be bullied or intimidated. She was someone in a position to get them in trouble. Turner was the first to shake himself loose. His usual tone and confidence were gone, betrayed by the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He took one step backward, his hand falling away from the holster as he deliberately tried to force his face into a mask of control. He could still feel the anger simmering below the surface, but it was dying down now. He had been confronted with something that could jeopardize his career. That was not how things were meant to go. He was not used to people standing up to him, much less someone with more authority over him than he had. "What's this?" Turner demanded, though his voice was considerably less hostile than before. "Why didn't you say you were FBI earlier?" Brianne raised her eyebrow. Her voice now had an edge that dared him to think he was regaining control. "I shouldn't have had to. I was waiting for a friend in my own car, in a public space. That should have been enough for you." Grant cleared his throat. His voice was shaking. "We didn't know. We didn't realize." He trailed off. The size of the mistake they had just made was truly starting to hit him now. "You didn't ask," Brianna replied, her eyes darting between the two officers. "Instead, you escalated the situation from the moment you arrived, yelling, making assumptions, ordering me out of the car, without ever once considering that I might have a valid reason for being here." Turner's face looked pale, like someone who had seen a ghost. He was filled with shame, and for the first time, he didn't know what his next move was. He turned to Grant, his eyes as if begging his partner to interrupt and back him up. But Grant didn't look anywhere else but at the badge, his lips pressed into a thin line. Turner's jaw clenched in evident frustration as he tried to salvage the situation. "Look, we were just responding to a call," Turner said, his voice tight. "We had to check it out." And what exactly did the call say? Brianna asked, her eyes sharp. What made you think I was such a threat? Turner hesitated. The caller reported a suspicious vehicle. They said someone didn't belong in the neighborhood. The corners of Brianna's lips tightened. Didn't belong. And what made you think it was me? My skin color? My car? Or easier to assume I was up to no good since I didn't look like your average suburban resident? Grant squirmed uncomfortably, his face reddening by the second. Turner wasn't about to accept defeat just like that. He believed that he was doing his job. His pride was at stake, and apologizing to this woman would be admitting that he made a mistake in the first place. We were just doing our job, Turner said, his voice now defensive. We can't ignore calls like this. You might have been... Might have been what? Brianna cut in, her voice still calm but now laced with a sharpness that cut through the air. A threat? A criminal? You assumed the worst of me without asking a single question. You escalated the situation from the moment you arrived, refused to check my ID, despite your partner's suggestion. Your job is to protect and serve, not intimidate and harass. Turner's finger dug into his palm as she spoke, and his posture straightened. No one had spoken to him this way, ever. But then, this wasn't any civilian. Brianna was FBI, and she had the power to bring about an investigation into the incident, which was the last thing he wanted. Turner knew she was telling the truth, and deep down, that was why he was trying to be defensive. Grant was watching everything unfold behind Turner. He was starting to understand just how serious things had become. He stepped forward, his voice low but honest in tone. We didn't mean for it to go this way. We were trying to follow up on the report. It wasn't personal. The look on Brianna's face softened somewhat as she looked into Grant. Unlike Turner, he sounded genuinely apologetic, but that did not change what had happened. Whether it was personal or not does not change what you did. You came at me with hostility, assumed I was some kind of threat, and then treated me with disrespect. Is that how you answer every dispatch call? Or was your response just different because I wasn't white? Grant opened his mouth, then closed it again, clearly at a loss. He knew she was right. He'd known it too at the time things had started to spiral out of control. But instead of swallowing his fear and saying something, he had been a coward and allowed Turner to take the lead, and now they were both suffering the consequences. Still trying to grasp any semblance of command, Turner crossed his arms over his chest. We didn't know who you were. You should have identified yourself sooner. Brianna's eyes narrowed. Her voice took on a steelier edge. And if I hadn't been an FBI agent, what then? What would have happened if I were just an ordinary person sitting in my car waiting for a friend? Would you have treated me the same way? Turner faltered for a moment, the weight of her question hitting him squarely in the chest. He knew the answer, and so did she. Brianna leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice. That's the problem, Officer Turner. You didn't treat me as an innocent person just waiting on a friend. You treated me like a criminal from the second you arrived and saw I was black. And that's what I'm going to report. The blood drained from Turner's face as her words registered. It was a complete role reversal of power, with the consequences of his actions now hanging over him like an axe. He had lost control of the situation, and worse, he had absolutely no idea how to fix it. The mention of a report made Grant's eyes pop out in disbelief. Wait, there's no need for that. We can talk about this. We'll file our own report, make sure it's clear that this was some sort of misunderstanding. Brianna shook her head slowly. That wasn't any misunderstanding. It was just plain discrimination. And that's not something I can let go. The weight of her words just hung in the air, choking any form of denial or justification. The remnant of Turner's confidence had disappeared at the mention of making a report. His face reflected frustration, panic, and regret. He opened his mouth to speak, but for the very first time, no words came out. It was an issue that spoke for itself. It fell on him like a ton of bricks, and there was no talking his way out of it. Turner knew he could not afford for his superiors to hear about this. This would be the second time he would be reprimanded for racial profiling and police misconduct. He turned and caught the look of desperation in Grant's eyes. "Please, ma'am, we'll make sure this doesn't happen again," Turner pleaded. "Yes, we'll take responsibility," Grant muttered, backing his partner. Brianna was not falling for it. "You'll take responsibility, all right, but not just to me. You'll answer to your superiors for this." Turner's panic turned to desperation. "Look, we're sorry, okay? This got out of hand, but we can fix it. Just don't report this. We'll lose our jobs." She stared at him with a smirk on her face. "And what if I had lost more than my patience tonight? What if I'd lost my freedom or worse because of your assumptions? You messed up, and now you'll pay the price." She spoke as if her words were hammer blows, each one landing and driving home a reality the officers could no longer refuse to acknowledge. They had crossed a line, one that could not be rubbed out with words of apology or excuse. The weight of their actions was falling upon them, and there was no escape. Turner's shoulders slumped in defeat. This could not be happening to him. Was he going to lose his job over this? He dropped his head and let the fight seep out of him. "I'm sorry," he muttered. Brianna turned to look at the officers. She noticed that Grant actually looked really remorseful. "We really are sorry. We messed up. Please, don't ruin our careers over this." Brianna's face softened a little, but her resolution did not falter. "This isn't about destroying your careers. This is about responsibility. If I don't turn you in, you'll pull it again on some poor woman who doesn't have an FBI badge to get her out of the situation." The silence was heavy with the weight of the truth neither officer could accept. They had assumed. They had let prejudice take hold. And now they would pay the price. Brianna, clutching the badge, watched as realization finally settled on them. The regret was apparent on their faces, but it was far too late. The damage was done. "I'll be filing a formal complaint," she said in a low tone, her voice firm. "And I suggest you both think long and hard about how you conduct yourselves in the future." With that, she let her badge drop and turned her eyes away from the two uniformed officers, allowing them to stand in the weight of their own mistakes. The look on their faces was worth it all, Brianna thought to herself as she leaned back into her car, leaving the officers to fight with their guilt. She had watched their confidence and ego break slowly as the grim understanding of what just happened dawned on them. She loved that she had been able to compose herself despite the shouting and orders thrown at her. Training both in and out of law enforcement had long ago taught her how to remain calm under pressure. Unfortunately, incidents like this weren't new territory for her. She'd been here before, though not always with the badge to back her up. Many times, her status as an FBI agent had sheltered her from the worst, but that wasn't the case for everyone. Brianna thought of all the people who looked like her, who found themselves in situations like this and had it end in far worse ways. And though tonight her badge had changed the dynamics, it was an underlying problem that should be discussed. Her mind flashed back to her family and the circular conversations they'd had for years growing up about how to live in the world as a Black person in America. All her life, her mother had cautioned her to stay calm with police, even when it felt wrong. Keep your hands visible. Don't raise your voice, and never, ever give them a reason to think you're a threat. Those words had been drilled into her since childhood, and tonight was just another example of why they were necessary. But Brianna was tired of playing by these unspoken rules. She was tired of the constant justification, despite not doing anything wrong. Tired of being stared at for being somewhere most people believe people like her should not be able to be. Tired of being twice as good just to be seen as enough. The calmness she put on now wasn't because she wasn't affected. It was a shield, a necessity in moments like this. But nobody knew about the amount of strength and restraint that was necessary to stay calm when every fiber in your body was screaming out. But she knew better, and she couldn't afford to lose control. Brianna leaned back a fraction in her seat, taking a slow, controlled breath. Survival mode was over. She was in control now, and she was going to stay that way. The weight of their mistake still lingered on the officers. They exchanged nervous glances. Turner, who seemed to take every opportunity to flash his power during the whole incident, was now standing deflated. The pretending and fake power melting away to something that suspiciously looked like fear. His lips were pressed into a tight line, but even though he said nothing, Brianna could sense turmoil brewing just beneath the surface. Turner was trying to cling to whatever shard of control remained, but Brianna knew it was a fight he was losing. Grant was audibly the most remorseful for their actions. His shoulders were slumped in defeat, but Brianna could tell his primary focus was on preventing her from sending a report to his superiors. He glanced at Brianna with an expression tinged both with regret and shame, as if coming to terms with the reality of what his involvement in this situation had involved. Brianna could tell that Grant was not as hardened as Turner. He was far from innocent. But, for what it was worth, the look on his face said he understood the depth of what had transpired. With a steady, calm voice this time, Brianna spoke with the full authority of her rank. "You two need to ask yourselves a fundamental question," she said, her eyes locking onto Turner's. "What would have happened if I wasn't carrying this badge? If I wasn't an FBI agent? Would this situation have gone the same way?" Turner looked away, his jaw clenching, but he didn't say another word. Grant, however, met her gaze, his expression conflicted. "We wouldn't have..." Grant's voice choked and broke. "It would not have escalated this far." Brianna's eyes flashed briefly, but her tone did not rise. "Wouldn't it have? Really think about it, Officer Grant. How many calls have you taken where some poor guy was considered suspicious because he was in a neighborhood? How often do you escalate a situation because somebody didn't look like they belonged?" Grant didn't say a word, but Brianna saw it in his eyes. He knew the answer, even if he couldn't bring himself to say it. Turner muttered under his breath, still not making eye contact. "We were just doing our job." Brianna's expression hardened. "No, you weren't. It's your job to protect and serve, to treat every human being with respect and dignity, regardless of skin color and the neighborhood they happen to be in. But that's not what you did. You treated me like a suspect the moment you saw me. You didn't ask questions. You didn't assess the situation. You immediately assumed I was up to no good." The accusation was direct, and the officers shifted uncomfortably, the reality of their actions settling over them. Brianna wasn't raising her voice, but the weight of her words was more powerful than any loud voice could have been. "I've policed long enough to know that split-second decisions can save lives," Brianna said, her voice unwavering. "But tonight you weren't making decisions based on threat assessment. You were acting on bias. You saw a black woman sitting in a car and you assumed she didn't belong. You assumed she was up to no good. And that's the problem." The silence that followed was heavy. Grant opened his mouth to say something, but the words just wouldn't come out. Turner remained stiff. He could not bring himself to look at Brianna. "You both should be asking yourselves how many other people you've treated this way, said Brianna, her voice low. "How many people you've intimidated or harassed because they didn't fit into your idea of who belongs in certain spaces." Brianna stopped there, allowing the weight of her words to sink in. She did not raise her voice, as she did not have to. The truth of the matter was sufficient. And she was not speaking on her behalf. She was speaking on behalf of the many people who had experienced similar incidents, most of whom did not wear a badge that could protect them. Brianna finally exhaled after what felt like a very long moment. Her breath was slow, deliberate. The tension in her chest remained, though she'd kept it leashed. She couldn't let herself get emotional. Anger, frustration, and even hurt would only give Turner more cause to believe he held some kind of power over her. And that was one thing she was not going to do. "Look," Grant finally said, his voice strained. "We didn't mean for it to go like this. We thought we were following protocol." Brianna's eyes wandered to Grant. Her stare latched onto his features. He sounded sorry, but that didn't blot out the fact that he had still been a part of what had happened. "Protocol?" Brianna repeated serenely. "Is it protocol to approach anyone with your hand resting on your weapon? To raise your voice before you even know what's going on?" He looked down, his shoulders slumping. "No," he said. "It's not. And yet, that's what happened," replied Brianna, not willing to let him off the hook. "It's more than a mistake. It's a pattern, and it's dangerous." Grant nodded, though he still refused to meet her eyes. "I understand," he said quietly. "You're right, but then again, Turner hadn't uttered a word yet. His pride was in the way, and the truth of what had been said was now sitting over him. "And you, Officer Turner?" Brianna asked, subtle but directly to the core. "Do you realize the seriousness of what just went on here?" Turner finally looked at her, his face hardening for a moment before softening into what looked like resignation. He didn't answer, but the way his shoulders slumped slightly told Brianna all she needed to know. "I am filing a formal report," Brianna said firmly. "This is not something that I can let go of. If I were you, I'd take this as an opportunity to reflect on how you approach situations like this in the future." None of the officers said a word, but the weight of what she had said was undeniable. They knew what was to come: disciplinary action and an internal investigation, and their careers might never recover from this if they had a job after the whole ordeal. But that wasn't Brianna's concern. Her concern was to make sure this didn't happen again to her or anybody else. Slowly, Brianna exhaled, starting to release some of that tension in her body. She had said what she needed to say. Now was the time to walk away. Even so, as she prepared to leave, she knew this wasn't over. This was one battle in a much greater war on systemic bias, racial profiling, and abuse of power by those in authority. Brianna took one last look at the officers before she fastened her seatbelt to drive off. She had not realized how tight she had been gripping the steering wheel, but the finger marks on the leather covering of the wheel told a story of how tense the situation had really been. The car's engine purred softly as she pulled off from the curb, leaving Turner and Grant to the neighborhood and their own thoughts on the consequences of their actions. As Brianna drove down the deserted street, she felt frustration, relief, and exhaustion all at once. But above all, this feeling of purpose flooded her consciousness. She hadn't only stood up for herself. She stood up for every person who had ever experienced racial profiling and police misconduct, and she would continue to do so no matter how many times she found herself in a situation like this. For now, however, Brianna allowed herself a little break. She had handled herself well. As Brianna drove home, she remembered that she had ended up not picking up her friend. The incident had scattered all her plans for the day. Tonight had been another reminder that no matter how high she climbed, no matter how many accolades she achieved, she would still be judged first on the color of her skin. That thought weighed heavily on her as she pulled into the driveway of her house. As Brianna sat in her car, gathering herself, Turner and Grant remained on the street, both standing near the patrol car, still reeling from what had just happened. Turner paced back and forth, still in shock. This can't be happening. The department won't take this third strike quietly with him. This was going to be the first complaint filed regarding Grant, so he wasn't really going to face much of a reprimand. But Turner couldn't say the same for himself. "You've got to be kidding me," Turner muttered, his voice sharp with incredulity. "An FBI agent? Out of all the people we could have—" "Don't," Grant cut in, low but firm in tone. "Just don't. We screwed up. We can't spin this any other way." Turner gave him a confused look. "I was doing my job. We were responding to a call, and she wasn't cooperative. That badge doesn't change the fact that she was being suspicious." Grant let out a deep sigh, running his hand through his hair. "No, Turner. She wasn't suspicious. She was just sitting in her car waiting for someone. We escalated it. You started the problem." Turner's face hardened. "You're blaming me for this? You're the one who backed me up when I told her to step out of the car." Grant met his gaze, his own frustration evident. "Yeah, I did. Because I trusted your judgment. But I've come to learn that your judgment was wrong." The two officers stared at each other, the tension between them growing thicker by the second. To Turner, it felt like a betrayal. Grant was supposed to have his back no matter what. But here they were, standing on the side of the road, their mistake looming over them like a dark cloud. Turner couldn't shake the anger that was boiling inside him. He was angry at the situation, at Brianna, and now at Grant for pointing the finger at him. "You think I don't know that?" Turner snarled, his voice rising. "You think I don't get that we screwed up? But you know what this means, right? That report she's going to file? It's going to end our careers. We're done. Finished." Grant didn't say a word, but his face spoke volumes. He knew Turner wasn't wrong. A formal complaint from a federal agent wasn't something to be taken lightly. There would have to be an investigation, and given what had occurred, it wasn't hard to imagine how that would end. They'd be held accountable for their actions. "She had every right to file that complaint," Grant said finally after a long pause. "And we deserve whatever comes next." Turner's eyes narrowed, his temper flaring again. "You're just going to roll over and take it? You're okay with losing your job over this?" Grant pushed off the car and turned to face Turner squarely. "What do you expect me to do, Turner? We can't go back. We crossed a line, and now we have to deal with the consequences." Turner's fists clenched as frustration and panic coursed through his body. The gravity of what was happening began to choke him, the mere helplessness fueling his anger. He couldn't let it go. He couldn't accept that this mistake, this moment, would define the rest of his life. In his mind, it wasn't fair. He had been doing his job, responding to a call. How had this turned into a mess so quickly? "I'm not losing everything because of this," Turner growled in a low, dangerous tone. "There's got to be a way to fix it." Grant's face darkened, his patience wearing thin. "Fix it? How do you think you can fix this, Turner? Unless you have a way to go back in time that I don't know about. It's done." Turner was silent for a moment. He was trying to figure out what the best play was as he weighed his options. There had to be a way to make it all go away. He couldn't allow this to be his end, wouldn't. He'd worked too hard, invested too many years, to lose it all on something like this. "There's always a way," Turner muttered, much to himself and hardly to Grant at all. Grant stepped closer, suspicion drawing his eyes together. "What are you talking about?" Turner was slow to answer, his mind still racing for a solution. Suddenly, an idea came to his mind. It wasn't a good idea. He knew that much, but sometimes desperation clouded judgment. He turned to Grant, his face hard and stubborn. "Look," Turner said, his voice low. "We've got to control the narrative. When we write our reports, we make sure they match. We say she was acting aggressively and that she resisted our commands. She might be FBI, but she's still one person. If it's our word against hers, we can make it stick." Grant recoiled slightly, his face struck with shock. "You're kidding me, right? You want to lie? On record?" Turner crossed his arms over his chest, his face set in a grim expression. "We've got to watch our backs. Do you think the department's going to have our backs if she files that complaint? No way. We're on our own here." Grant shook his head gradually, showing he wasn't going to be part of the idea. "That's not going to work, Turner. Do you really think she's going to let that slide? She'll have evidence from our body cam footage, maybe even witnesses, because I'm pretty sure I saw the curtains moving around a lot during the argument. And even if she didn't, you really want to risk perjuring ourselves?" Turner's jaw clenched. "It's better than just sitting around and waiting for them to ruin us." Grant stepped closer, his voice tight with frustration. "What you're talking about is illegal. It's not just about losing our jobs, Turner. If we lie on record, that's our freedom on the line. Do you really want to go to jail for this?" For a moment, Turner's confidence left him. Something about what Grant was saying was beginning to take root, but his anger and desperation still clouded his judgment. He wasn't ready to give up. "There's got to be something we can do," Turner muttered, though the certainty had deserted his voice now. Grant looked at him, his face unyielding. "We made a mistake, Turner, and now we have to own it. That's the only way forward." Turner stared back, his chest tight with rage and fear. He wanted to push back and argue that they could still come up with a way to defend themselves. But then he saw Grant's eyes, and he knew his partner wouldn't budge to any wrong plan he came up with. Grant had already made up his mind to confront the bitter reality that they found themselves in. He wasn't ready to attempt to salvage the situation. "I'm not going down like this," Turner said finally, his voice at little more than a whisper. "I won't." Grant shook his head, stepping back. "Then you're on your own." The words caught Turner like a kick in the gut. He stood there, paralyzed, as Grant turned his back on him and began walking toward the patrol car. He slammed the door as he stepped into the car, leaving Turner to the eerie silence of the deserted street. Grant had come to the terms that there might be no excuse for his actions. He sank into the car seat and sat in silence for a few moments, the weight of the evening bearing down on him. His heart was heavy with regret, but he knew the only way forward was to take responsibility for his actions. He wasn't proud of how everything had turned out, but he knew that lying to protect himself was only going to make everything worse. He looked to Turner, who was still standing outside by the roadside, staring blankly out into the street. Grant could see the storm of emotions that swirled behind his partner's eyes, but there was nothing more he could say. Turner would have to make his peace with this. The silence just seemed to drag on and on. Grant thought of Brianna and how she had remained so cool amidst their hostilities. Respectful, even though they'd treated her no better than a criminal for the crime of sitting in her car. The shame of it ate at him, something he would remember for a very long time. Finally, Turner returned to the car, his face filled with sadness. He did not utter a word as he buckled himself in and stared forward with a stern look on his face. He turned the key, and the gentle hum of the patrol car soaked into the silent street. They pulled off the curb and drove away from the site where their mistake had unfolded. Neither of them said a word as they drove back to the station, heads hung low, carrying on their shoulders the significance of what was to come. Brianna was still trying to regain her composure in her car. The incident still left her feeling shaky. Despite the fact that she was trying to be tough, she could not help but feel betrayed and sad. She realized that she was tightly gripping the cool leather cover of the steering wheel. She was still holding on to her FBI badge, a reminder of the power that saved her from a situation that would have turned ugly. It was not just the badge alone that saved her. It was her control over her actions, her words, her emotions. It had all gone a long way in diffusing the situation. Brianna's mind went back to the moment she decided to flash her badge. That flicker of disbelief and shock in Turner's eyes was almost palpable. In that swift flash of a moment, the balance of power had reversed, and the aggression of the officers had crumbled before her very eyes, giving way to fear and regret, as if it had just then dawned on them how gravely wrong they'd been. Brianna hadn't missed that Turner's hand had rested on his weapon throughout the whole incident. That was the source of his power. Everything in her had wanted to scream at the injustice of it all, yet she had kept her voice calm. The soft hum of her phone vibrated in the passenger seat, breaking her thoughts. She glanced at the screen, seeing her friend's name pop up. Brianna shared a complex with one of her friends, and she was probably calling to ask why she had been parked in the driveway for some time. Brianna took a deep breath and answered. Her voice came out even, but the tension of the evening still lingered in her tone. "I'm on my way up," she said quietly, looking toward the house. "Sorry, I was handling something." Her friend Monica responded at once, her voice tinged with worry. "For over 45 minutes now? Are you all right? You sound off." Brianna was caught off guard for a moment, but she did not want to really unload all that had just gone down. But she knew she could not hold it in. "I'm fine," she said with a measured tone. "Talk to me," Monica replied with a soft voice. Brianna didn't know when it all came tumbling out. "2 cops stopped me outside your neighborhood. It got tense." There was a quick pause on the other side, and then Monica spoke up. Her voice was laced with anger and disbelief. "What? Why? What happened?" Brianna blew out a deep breath as the anger came rushing back. "They got a call about a suspicious person sitting in a car. You know how it goes. I stayed calm, but they didn't. It wasn't until I flashed them my badge that they backed off." Monica said nothing for a moment, her anger growing. "Unbelievable. They really pulled that on you?" "Yeah," Brianna said calmly, though her voice came out tired. "The moment they saw me, they made assumptions based off on my race and the neighborhood I was in." There was a heavy pause before Monica spoke again, her voice much softer now, but with an undercurrent of frustration. "I'm so sorry, Bri. Can't believe you had to go through this." Brianna sighed, losing some grip on the steering wheel. "It is what it is. But it shouldn't have to be." Brianna tried to change the topic to something lighter before she ended the call. She leaned back in her seat, closing her eyes for a moment. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the confrontation was finally wearing off, leaving her with a dull, throbbing headache and a knot of tension in her chest. But beneath that exhaustion was another feeling, a feeling of grim satisfaction. She had taken control of the situation. She had turned their assumptions and prejudices on them, and now they would have to deal with the aftermath of their own doing. But it still didn't seem like any kind of victory. As Brianna sat there in silence, her mind went back to the meeting, playing over every word, every gesture. She had been calm, but it hadn't been easy. The fact that she'd had to pull out her FBI badge to get them to treat her with even a modicum of respect left a bitter taste in her mouth. Would they have backed down if she hadn't been an agent? Would they have continued to escalate until they became dangerous? She knew the answer. She'd seen it happen too many times. The memory of Turner's face suddenly flashed into her mind, the way his aggression had crumbled into sheer panic when he saw the badge. For a split second, he had looked utterly lost, like he didn't know what to do next. She had seen this once or twice before. the realization that something was terribly wrong. It was one of those moments that seemed to repeat themselves throughout her career, particularly as a black woman in law enforcement. But it was Grant's reaction that had hit her the most. Unlike Turner, Grant seemed genuinely remorseful about the whole situation. It was not just because she was a female FBI agent, but at the realization of what they had done. He had said little during their confrontation, but his body language spoke volumes. The regret, the discomfort, it was all there. He knew Turner was crossing a line, but he had done nothing about it. Brianna had hoped that maybe, just maybe, he would be different, that he could be a voice of reason, stepping in to de-escalate the situation. But he had ended up just following Turner's lead, and it made him just as guilty. Brianna remembered the slight tremble in her hands as she had held the badge, willing her body to remain calm. It wasn't just fear. She had been thoroughly disappointed and frustrated at having to present her badge to keep from being treated like a criminal. Tonight, the badge had been her shield, but Brianna knew how. For so many others, there was no such shield. Too often, the outcome was different, worse, tragic, irreversible. She thought of all the names that had filled the headlines these past years, of lives cut short because of encounters just like this one. The thought made her nauseous. She pressed her palms to her eyes, trying to block out the thoughts and push down the frustration building at that moment. The truth was that Brianna had devoted her entire career to fighting for justice, accountability, and fairness. Nights like this were just a reminder of how far she still had left to go. As long as the world saw her as a black woman first and a police officer second, no amount of years on the job, no amount of training in the academy, no amount of authority behind a badge meant anything. It wasn't just the badge that defined her, but all the assumptions people made before they ever saw it. Brianna let out a deep sigh as she finally sat up straighter in her chair. She couldn't sit around dwelling over this forever, but she wasn't going to let that anger go to waste. She was going to report and hold these officers accountable for their actions. She glanced toward the house again, where Monica was no doubt waiting inside, eager to see her. For a moment, Brianna debated walking inside to unload the weight of what had just happened, but she decided against it. She had already told her enough. Tonight, Brianna just needed space. She needed time to process what had happened and to regain her composure fully before she was ready to talk about it. The key turned in the ignition, and the car's engine purred to life, vibrating through her chest. Brianna took one last look at her house, and then she put the car in reverse and backed out of the driveway. She needed to clear her mind before she was up for conversations or explanations. But for now, she had to drive to clear her head and get the weight of the incident off her shoulders, if only for a little while. Driving down the quiet street, it was impossible for Brianna not to think about Officer Turner and Grant all over again. The confidence in their assumptions had been sadly defeated by reality. They had been left standing in the wake of their own mistake, with clearly painted faces of panic and regret. She wondered what lay in store for them in the days to come. She was going to do her best to see that they faced some kind of consequences. This was not going to be another case of misconduct brushed under the rug. She hoped her report would amount to something, that Turner and Grant would take the full force of their actions. But buried deep inside her mind, Brianna knew justice was never a given. It was always something she had to fight for every single time. The road lay stretched out before her as Brianna's hand slightly tightened on the steering wheel, driving without any destination in mind. She was fighting not only for herself anymore, but for each person who had walked in her shoes and for those who did not make it out alive. And she would keep fighting, no matter how many badges it took. The ride back to the station was in silence. The air inside the patrol car was thick with unsaid words. Grant turned his head to glance sideways at Turner, whose jaw was clenched tightly enough to make the muscle in his cheek twitch. Turner's hands gripped the steering wheel so tight that his knuckles were white. He stared down the road ahead, refusing to give Grant any eye contact. Turner was annoyed with Grant's refusal to lie about what had happened. The silence became worse as time passed, each mile adding another layer to the tension. Grant knew what Turner was thinking. He was probably still trying to find a way to get out of this mess unscathed. But Grant wasn't planning to play along with whatever he had planned. They had crossed a line, and now there would be consequences. And given Brianna's status as an FBI agent, this wasn't going to be some complaint the department could easily look past. After some minutes, Turner finally broke the silence, his voice strained. "You realize what this means, don't you?" Grant nodded, but didn't say a word. His voice was still caught in his throat, stuck behind the lump of his emotions as he tried to work through the jumbled knot of regret, shame, and flat-out disbelief at how quickly it had spiraled out of control. Turner spoke again, with just a tinge of bitterness creeping into his voice. "We're cooked, man. You know that, right? One complaint from an FBI agent, and they'll make an example out of us. They'll throw us to the wolves." Grant let out a deep breath, fighting his anger. "We did this to ourselves, Turner. We can't go around pushing people around and not expect a response of some kind." Turner looked at him with a glare that seemed like his eyes were burning with resentment. "You think you can just stand there and act like you didn't go along with it? You were right there with me, backing me up." Grant didn't back down from his gaze. "I was wrong, and I know it. But you were the one who escalated the situation. You didn't just approach her. You went in hot, accusing her before she'd even said a word. And now we're both paying for it." Turner snorted and shook his head. "Oh, so now it's all on me? Don't act like you're blameless, Grant. We're partners. We made these calls together." Grant wanted to argue, to say that he had tried to de-escalate the situation, that he had suggested they ask for her ID rather than make her get out of the car. He knew it would be pointless. The truth was, he had gone along with Turner. He hadn't spoken up when he should have. He wasn't the voice of reason for Brianna when she needed him the most. And now, his silence made him just as guilty. With a deep breath, Grant sank back against the headrest, his mind racing. He felt the guilt clawing at him minute after minute of that encounter, replaying in his brain like a broken record. He had watched Brianna's calm composure and her polite attempts to explain herself, but he had ignored it. He had stood by and done nothing while Turner yelled orders at her and treated her like a criminal, all because some nosy neighbor had called in a suspicious black woman sitting in a car. "We can't undo what was done," Grant said, his tone low but firm. "We have to face whatever comes next, and maybe it's about time we both started taking responsibility for our actions." Turner's hand wrapped around the wheel like a vice, his face contorted in defiance. "I'm not going down without a fight. She made it clear she was going to report us. So fine. But if we're going to go down, we'll go down swinging." Turner's words sent a chill down Grant's spine. He had known his partner long enough to recognize the dangerous way his mind worked. Turner wasn't just desperate. His ego was bruised, and his authority challenged. He was cornered, and the only thing he planned to do was find a way to shift the blame and turn the tables. Grant could see it in his eyes, the simmering rage that threatened to boil over at any moment. "What are you talking about?" Grant asked warily, his voice even but cautious. Turner's lips curled in a sneer. "I'm saying that we don't have to go down for this. She's not the only one with connections. We know people too. People who can help us reframe the situation." Grant's gut twisted at what he was implying. "You're talking about lying, about turning the story to make her out to be the aggressor." Turner shrugged, his lips curled into a smug grin. "I'm talking about survival. We say something like she was acting out, refusing to cooperate, making a scene. What are they going to take our word or hers? We can spin this. make it look like she escalated the situation, not us. Grant felt the weight of Turner's words settle over him like a dark cloud. The idea was repulsive, but Turner's desperation in his tone drove home just how dead serious he was. For Turner, it wasn't about saving his career. It was about saving face and not being outdone by some black woman. That pride was twisted, and it poisoned any chance at redemption they had. "This is a lousy idea," Grant said, his voice low. "You're talking about placing an innocent woman in jeopardy to cover up our own mistake. She didn't escalate anything. We did. And lying to protect ourselves won't change that." Turner threw him a deadly glare. So much bitterness laced his tone. "What's next? Roll over and let her drag us through the mud? You want to be the scapegoat of this department? That's fine by me. But I'm not going to sit around and let my life get ruined because of some misunderstanding." Grant shook his head, his frustration rising. "This wasn't a misunderstanding, Turner. This was us acting out of bias, out of unchecked assumptions. And if we don't own up to that, we're just as guilty as any other officer who abuses their authority." Turner's face scrunched up in disbelief as if he couldn't comprehend why Grant would set him up. "So that's it, huh? You're just going to throw me under the bus? After everything we've been through?" Grant's heart sank as he saw the desperation in Turner's eyes. Turner was grasping at straws. He was ready to do anything to save himself, no matter the cost. And for the first time, Grant realized just how deep Turner's prejudice and sense of entitlement ran. It wasn't about right or wrong for him. It was about power, about maintaining control. "We did this to ourselves, Turner," Grant said calmly, "and trying to twist the truth cannot change what happened. We must take the blame for that. To that extent, we do owe her." Turner's face hardened, and his anger returned with more intensity. "You think that's going to help us? You think admitting fault is going to make any difference? They'll destroy us, Grant. They don't care about fairness. They want a scapegoat. And we're it." Grant stared at him, watching the fear behind the anger. He saw the desperation propping up the defiance. He knew Turner's pride had taken a hit, and his sense of authority called into question in a way he hadn't been prepared to handle. None of that changed what was true about what they did, though. "I'd rather go down telling the truth than live with a lie," Grant said finally, his voice firm. The lines around Turner's eyes deepened, his jaw clenched, and he turned away, resentment and frustration twisting his face as his mind ran over his next action. For a moment, neither said a word, the tension between them almost palpable, choking. "You always were the soft one," Turner spat. The words dripped with contempt. "Always trying to play the hero. Always trying to be the moral compass. Well, let me tell you something, Grant. This world doesn't care about heroes. It's every man for himself out here, and if you can't see that, then you're a fool." Grant looked at him, his face calm, though his heart was pounding in his chest. "Maybe I am a fool, but I'm not a liar. And I'm not going to be part of this, Turner. If you want to go down swinging, that's on you. But I'm not risking everything to protect a lie." Turner snorted, shaking his head in disdain. "You really are something, you know that? Throwing away your career over some high-minded sense of morality. Do you think anyone's going to care? You think she's going to care? She's the one trying to ruin us." Grant said nothing. He knew it was pointless to argue because, by now, Turner was beyond reason, consumed entirely by his own fear and malice. His mind was made up, and Grant knew he would never sway him with words. Finally, Grant turned away, his heart heavy with disappointment and regret. He had thought that Turner was a partner, a friend, a man he could trust. But tonight had torn that illusion away, and he saw before him only a man who would stop at nothing to protect his interests, even if it meant betraying the truth and jeopardizing the career of a fellow officer. The station loomed ahead. Its lights were a harsh reminder of the reality awaiting them. Grant took a deep breath, bracing himself for what was to come. The soft buzzing from the fluorescent lights of the station seemed to get duller as Turner and Grant entered the precinct. Every step Grant and Turner took to their desk felt like they were walking to their doom. Other officers were scattered around, some typing out reports and others preparing for the night's patrol, completely oblivious to the turmoil that plagued the two partners. Turner was still furious, his face set in a mask of frustration and resentment. A feeling of fear washed over Grant from what was to come. His conscience kept disturbing him, eating into all the reasons and justifications he had used earlier. They looked at each other for a moment, neither speaking, yet both knowing the next course of action left for them. They had to document the events of their patrol and every dispatch call they attended. They had done it 100 times before, writing down everything that happened during their shift. But this time, the words they'd have to write felt like an indictment of their own failures, exposing the prejudice and poor judgment that had led to their disastrous confrontation with Brianna. This was different. They sat at their desks, facing each other. The only sound filling the air was the clacking of keyboards as they both began to type their accounts. Grant typed slowly, stopping at the end of each sentence to wrestle with the words, framing the events truthfully without minimizing his role in escalation. Every detail that went onto the page seemed to bring back memories of everything that had happened. Every word was an anguished acknowledgement of guilt. Grant started typing furiously, trying his best to capture the whole situation. He began with the call that had warned them about a suspicious individual in the neighborhood. Suspicious? Grant muttered to himself. The word sounded bitter in his mouth. He knew that if he were being honest, he'd have to write that Brianna had done absolutely nothing to earn the word suspicious. But how could he write that? How could he put in writing that they had started the conversation assuming things about her and hoping to prove those assumptions right, rather than going into it with professionalism? It felt like signing his resignation. He looked over at Turner, who was finishing up his report, his face a mask of defiance as he tapped out the last few lines. Turner leaned back, crossing his arms as he glanced over at Grant. His eyes seemed to warn him not to implicate himself. Grant knew that Turner wanted him to align his story with his report, to create a united front, and make it seem as though they'd acted out of protocol rather than prejudice. But Grant couldn't bring himself to go along with it. Instead, he took a deep breath, closed his eyes for a moment, and continued to type, using a different approach that reflected the truth as best as he could. He wrote that they had approached Brianna in hostility, and Turner had escalated the situation without asking questions, despite Brianna's calm demeanor. He chose every word with consideration, producing an honest report candid enough to clear his conscience. As he finished, he leaned back in his chair, his heart pounding, and stared at his screen. The words glared coldly back at him, a reminder of everything that had happened earlier. He knew this report filed would bring repercussions with it, possibly disciplinary actions. There was, however, a quiet feeling of relief knowing he told the truth, even if it was at his own cost. Turner cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "You done?" Grant nodded. His hand rested on the submit button but wasn't actually touching it. Turner's eyes narrowed while his face hardened, having sensed the hesitation. "Don't overthink it. Just submit it, and let's get this over with." Grant looked down at his keyboard, the weight of Turner's gaze upon him. There was almost a crushing pressure to do what Turner wanted and tone down the incident to match Turner's version. But he forged ahead, his determination firm as he clicked on the submit button. Grant could sense the silent disappointment in Turner's eyes, and for a second, he looked like he was going to say something. Instead, He gave Grant a sharp nod and turned away, his face set in a scowl as he left the desk and grumbled under his breath. Grant watched him go. The deed was done, and there was no going back. Whatever bond had been between them as partners, he knew it was probably fractured beyond repair. The fact that Grant had not done what he wanted had wounded Turner's pride. Almost immediately, a new email popped up regarding a follow-up with his superior regarding the report filed earlier. Grant's heart skipped a beat as he read the contents of the mail. This was definitely going to become a drawn-out process. The report filing had been only the first phase, and now there would be scrutiny on the department, maybe even by the community as a whole. Grant stood up, the wave of exhaustion washing over him. He moved toward the break room, desperate for a moment to himself before everything came tumbling down. As Grant worked to the break room, he found out that some officers had found out about the incident. He heard short convos from other officers as they talked in hushed tones about what had happened. The word about their confrontation with Brianna was spreading fast. Grant felt the stares and whispered questions follow him as he moved through the station. When Grant got to the break room, he poured a cup of coffee into a styrofoam. The bitter smell filled his nostrils as he stared into the dark liquid. He had this intense feeling of unease settle over him. Had he not done the right thing by telling the truth? The problem was, every time he played back Turner's words in his mind, there was this nagging doubt there. He felt the voice behind him before he actually heard it. "Rough night?" Grant turned to find Officer Phillips leaning casually against the doorframe as he watched him curiously. Phillips was that laid-back kind of guy around the station, but he was one of those individuals who always had his ear to the ground for gossip and rumors. "You could say that," Grant returned, sipping his coffee as the bitter taste made him frown his face. Phillips nodded, his eyes just a little narrower. "I heard about the run-in with the FBI agent. That's quite a situation." Grant looked away. He wasn't really in the mood for chit-chat. "Yeah, not our finest moment." Phillips raised an eyebrow. "So what happened then? The rumors are unbelievable. Different people have different versions of what happened. Some say she was being aggressive, others that it was some sort of misunderstanding. Sounds like a huge scandal to me." Grant let out a deep sigh, feeling the weight of Phillips' question. He knew he had to be very careful with his words, and at the same time, avoid making the truth sound less than it was. "It was more than a misunderstanding," Grant replied. "We went in too hard. Assumptions were made, and it got out of hand. That's all I'll say." Phillips watched him for a moment, his eyes thoughtful. "So you're saying it was on you guys?" Grant hesitated, feeling the sting of admitting it. "Yeah, Phillips, it was on us." Phillips nodded, a flicker of understanding passing over his face. "Tough call, but I respect you for owning it. Not everyone here would have done the same." Grant mustered a small, grim smile. "Yeah, well, I'm not sure it's going to mean much. I think this one's going to stick." Phillips leaned back, crossing his arms. "Maybe, but sometimes standing by the truth is all you've got. It's not easy, but it matters." He paused, his gaze steady. "You did the right thing, Grant. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." A weird sense of relief washed over Grant. To have someone else validate he had done the right thing sent ripples of calm through some of the doubt he had been fighting with. He knew much more was in store, but this was a start, at least. As he made his way to his desk, he found Turner staring at him from across the room, his face set in a cold, unreadable expression. There was a hardness in Turner's eyes, a resentment in his stare that told Grant without words their partnership was most probably history. Grant's stomach twisted, knowing he had lost not only a partner, but also a friend. Yet he had made his choice, and now he knew he'd have to live with it. The balance of power between Grant and Turner had been irreversibly altered. Grant, who had an unquestioned loyalty to Turner's authority, had come to see that the man he respected was just a prejudiced and biased officer, and that had fractured their relationship. Despite everything, Grant felt a sense of resolve he hadn't known in years. He would accept whatever consequences came his way, but he would do so with his conscience intact. As the night wore on, the station became extremely quiet. Grant cast one last glance around the station as he prepared to leave, the weight of what lay ahead heavy in his chest. The man who walked out that night was not the officer who had walked in, but as Grant turned and walked out the doors into the cool night air, he knew he had made the only choice he could live with. The following day, the tension was spreading across the station. By the time Grant arrived, a formal investigation was well on its way, and the rumors of the confrontation with Brianna had trickled down through the ranks. As he stepped into the precinct, he could hear the low buzz of whispers and sideways glances as he walked past his colleagues. Grant kept his head down, focused on reaching the office of their captain, Captain Howard, where he and Turner were to go and be questioned. As he got to Howard's office, Turner was already standing outside with a rigid stance and his arms crossed. Grant could feel the anger radiating off him. Turner barely acknowledged Grant's arrival, his gaze fixed somewhere else as though he couldn't even bear to look his former partner in the eye. A few minutes later, Captain Howard's door opened, and they were waved inside. Howard himself was a tall, broad-shouldered man with graying hair and a permanent furrow etched into his brow, as if he spent every waking moment frowning. He had a reputation for not tolerating nonsense from anyone, and this won him both respect and fear among the officers. Howard cleared his throat as they both walked in, taking a seat. "Let's cut to the chase," he said. His voice was firm and even, but with an unmistakable edge to it. "I have read your reports, and I have spoken with Agent Brianna Thompson. What I need to understand is how this situation escalated to where an FBI agent deems it necessary to file a formal complaint against this department." Turner straightened in his chair, his tone low and defensive. "Captain, we were out on a call about a suspicious person. We judged the situation according to procedure." Howard's brow arched, his eyes further narrowing. "Protocol?" "Turner, let's get real clear here. Agent Thompson was sitting in a parked car. To my knowledge, no evidence of criminal activity was found. Now, tell me, what does our protocol say when it comes to a situation with an unarmed individual, let alone one not committing a crime?" Turner hesitated, his eyes darting to Grant, but Grant kept silent, knowing anything he might say would just be pouring gasoline on the fire. Howard's gaze shifted to him, narrowing in a silent flash of exasperation. "Grant, in your report, you said you attempted to de-escalate, that you suggested asking for her identification instead of forcibly removing her from the car." Howard fastened a withering gaze on him. "Why didn't you argue? Why did you stand by and do nothing when Turner opted to escalate?" Grant swallowed. The shame and regret rose yet again. He took a deep breath and met Howard's eyes. "I should have, Captain. I made a judgment call, and it was the wrong one. I was following Turner's lead, and in hindsight, I see now that it was a mistake." Howard's expression softened somewhat, but it was still cold. "Following a partner's lead is one thing, Grant, but ignoring your own instincts and training? That's negligence." Grant winced at the words, unable to argue. "I understand. Sir, I take full responsibility for my role in this." Turner shifted beside him, his jaw clenching as he interposed. "If I may, sir, with all due respect, this has gotten blown out of proportion. Agent Thompson overreacted. She whipped out her badge and began flexing her weight. And now we're the ones who go to trial." Howard's eyes shot back to Turner. His voice was now much colder. "Mind your tone, Turner. This has nothing to do with Agent Thompson throwing her weight around. It's about your behavior and your actions toward a situation that called for a little more than professional inquiry. You escalated it, and from what I can tell, you did so based on some obvious prejudgment. Agent Thompson's race had nothing to do with the situation, yet you made assumptions and followed them up with action." Turner's face went red from pure anger, but he restrained himself. Turner opened his mouth to say his piece, but the captain quickly cut him off. "The fact is, this department is already under quite a bit of scrutiny from the public. An incident like this serves to add fuel to the fire, and I must take into consideration the consequences of your actions regarding how it reflects upon the department's reputation." Howard looked from one officer to the other, his gaze hardening. "It's no longer about what you did or did not do. Your actions bring bigger questions concerning issues like accountability, integrity, and respect for the badge." Howard let out a deep sigh, his eyes softening as he turned to Grant. "Grant, at least you tried to consider what you had done and why. Points for that. But it doesn't clear you of the blame. You have training and experience. You permitted Turner's method to override your better judgment." Grant just nodded at what the captain was saying. "I understand, Captain. I will accept whatever disciplinary action you feel necessary." Howard's gaze turned to Turner, his face hardening again. "And you, Turner. I'm going to recommend suspension without pay, pending a full internal investigation. The footage from the squad car, along with statements from all parties involved, will be reviewed by the disciplinary board. This is not the first complaint we're getting regarding your actions with people from other races. You don't get a slap on the wrist this time." Turner's jaw dropped in shock. "Suspension? You can't be serious, Captain. You're throwing me to the wolves?" Howard's tone was calm but resolute. "This is more than a single mistake, Turner. It is a betrayal of the trust invested in you as an officer. You didn't just botch a situation, you misused your authority." Turner's face screwed up in anger, but he kept silent, his body taut with pent-up anger. Howard leaned back and looked at each man. "As for you, Grant," Howard continued, his tone a little softer, "I am recommending a demotion and mandatory bias training. You will be reassigned to a partner, and you will have to prove to this department that you understand the weight of the responsibility that we carry." Grant nodded, feeling an odd mix of relief and guilt. The demotion hurt, but it was a fair result. He'd messed up massively, but he was being given the chance to learn and change. Turner wasn't so lucky, though. Grant could almost feel the anger emanating from him, resentment festering as he glared at Howard. "This department will not condone any misconduct," Howard added. "I want both of you to reflect on what happened. This is more than punitive measures. It is a lesson on accountability and an example for our community." He looked across at them one last time, the full weight of his eyes showing his disappointment. "Dismissed." As they emerged from Howard's office, Turner walked ahead. His hands were balled into fists. Grant trailed a few feet behind, careful not to give him a reason to last out at him. Grant's demotion altered everything in his life, from his position and status to his future within the department. But he knew that this was the course of action that must be taken. He had to be responsible, even if that meant starting all over. Turner was less forgiving. The moment they were out in the hallway, he turned toward Grant, his voice low and furious. "This is all on you, you know that? If you'd have just backed me up, none of this would be happening. We'd have a unified story, and they wouldn't have any reason to doubt us." Grant met Turner's glare, his frustration finally bubbling to the surface. "A unified story? You mean a lie, Turner. That's what you wanted, and I wasn't willing to go along with it." Turner's eyes went narrow as his face twisted in anger. So now you're some kind of hero? Because you threw me under the bus to save your own skin? I didn't throw you under the bus, Turner, Grant calmly replied. I told the truth. Maybe if you could accept that, then we wouldn't be in this position. Turner snorted and shook his head in disappointment. You've always been weak, Grant. Too soft for this job. That's why you're being demoted while I'm getting suspended. Grant's anger flared, but he forced himself to take a deep breath and remain calm. This job isn't about muscle, Turner. It's about character. It's about making the right call, even when it's tough. Maybe if you understood that, we wouldn't be in this mess in the first place. Turner's face reddened in rage, his jaw clenched. You're pathetic, he spat. And don't think this means I'm letting it go. You and I, we're done. With that, Turner turned on his heel and stormed down the hall, his feet echoing off the empty hallway. Grant watched him go. He felt a pang of regret in his chest. Despite everything that had happened, Turner had been his partner and friend. But events over the past few days had opened his eyes to a part of Turner that he couldn't ignore. A part fed by pride, by anger, by some desperate need to protect his authority at any cost. Grant sucked in a deep breath, preparing himself for what was coming next as he prepared to leave the station. Days later, Brianna sat in the lobby of her office, waiting for her appointment to stand before the Internal Review Board. Her complaint had sent shockwaves through the local police department as Turner and Grant's disciplinary actions came swiftly. But she knew this was only the beginning. She had filed her report not just because of anger, but because it was necessary. And she had made a promise to hold law enforcement to a higher standard, even if it meant going up against fellow officers. This was not her first case where she had to work with local law enforcement as an FBI agent. She was doing all this to remind herself and everybody else that she was in allegiance with justice and accountability, even when she stood all alone. After waiting for some minutes, the door finally swung open, and a woman emerged, carrying a clipboard. Agent Thompson, they're ready for you. Brianna stood, smoothing her jacket as she followed the woman through a series of hallways into a conference room where 3 members of the review board waited. They sat at a long table, their attention entirely on her as she entered. The chair for the internal review was a sharp-eyed woman called Dr. Caroline Mendez. She nodded to Brianna as she stepped in. Agent Thompson, thank you for coming in today. We have reviewed your report about Officers Turner and Grant, and we would like to speak with you in more detail about your experience. Brianna took a seat across from them. Thank you, Dr. Mendez. I appreciate being given the chance to explain in person what actually happened. Dr. Mendez leaned forward, pushing her glasses up on her nose as she stared at Brianna's report in her hand. You initially said the officers approached you with aggression as if they were hostile toward you before they even knew what you were doing in the car. Can you please describe what occurred that made you believe it was a biased action against you? Brianna took a deep breath and collected her thoughts. Immediately, the officers in question arrived. Their approach was aggressive. Immediately, they noticed I was black. They didn't ask questions. They barked orders. There was no effort at reasoning out the situation or even logically handling it. It was as if they had already found me guilty of something when all I did wrong was sit in my own car. One of the other members, a man with salt and pepper hair and a badge that identified him as Captain Warren from the Internal Affairs Unit, nodded thoughtfully. And in your experience, Agent Thompson, would you say that you're familiar with the de-escalation protocols typically followed by law enforcement? Brianna's lips pursed slightly. I am thoroughly aware of de-escalation methods. They are the backbone of training for the FBI, and they are supposed to be the cornerstone in police contact with civilians. Officers are trained to carefully assess situations and remain calm, especially when there is no reason to believe one is in immediate danger. Turner and Grant did just the opposite. They escalated the situation immediately, without any attempt to understand me. Dr. Mendez nodded, jotting down notes as Brianna spoke. In your report, you also mentioned that your status as an FBI agent was the only thing that reined in their actions, that they treated you like some sort of threat before you even showed your badge. Brianna was being cautious with her words. Exactly. They should have conducted themselves professionally right from the start, but I was just another suspicious person based on my skin color. That was until they saw that badge. The third board member, a much younger woman with community relations experience, Officer Patel, leaned forward while her eyes were soft. They focused intensely on her. How did that make you feel, Agent Thompson, knowing that your badge was the only thing protecting you at that moment? Brianna took a moment before answering. That night was still crystal clear in her mind. It was deeply disappointing and a scary experience. I am an FBI agent. Still, I was helpless until the badge was displayed. Not everyone has that protection. What happens to the ordinary citizens who don't carry a badge that can flip a situation around? That is why I filed this report. Turner and Grant's actions are just the tip of the iceberg in law enforcement. If they could act that way toward me, an agent, how would they treat someone who doesn't have the means to defend themselves? The room fell silent as each of the board members took in her words with expressions of contemplation and concern. It was Dr. Mendez who finally spoke. Agent Thompson, it's crystal clear from both your experience and insight just how grave this situation is. We understand that you're not filing this report for personal reasons, but as a matter of principle. That's right, Brianna said, her voice tight. It's not just about what happened to me. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. Turner and Grant need to be punished, but more than that, it sends a message that this is unacceptable behavior. It's a breach of public trust, a smear on all those officers who really do take their duties seriously. Captain Warren glanced over his notes before leaning back thoughtfully. Agent Thompson, in your report, you indicated that Officer Grant was conflicted during this encounter. Would you say he played a different role than Turner, or do you feel they were equally responsible? Brianna nodded to acknowledge complexity. Yes, Grant was reluctant, and at one point he even suggested a calmer approach. But all in all, he went along with Turner's aggressive tactics. So while I do feel that he was less driven by bias, he was complicit. In law enforcement, complicity in misconduct is just as harmful as direct action. Dr. Mendez turned to her colleagues for a moment, then back to Brianna. Thank you for your honesty, Agent Thompson. We are committed to an investigation that will be thorough and fair, and the review of this matter will be viewed under the scope of complete transparency. This is not entirely about one incident. It is about a culture of accountability. Brianna nodded, a slight sense of relief easing the tension in her chest. Thank you. I'm glad to know the department is taking this seriously. I believe in what we do as law enforcement officers, and I want to see our profession held to the highest standard. As the meeting was over, Dr. Mendez extended a hand, and with a firm handshake, Brianna left the room with a feeling of resolution. Support from the review board meant a great deal, but she knew real change would require continued pressure and vigilance. While her complaint may mean immediate action against Turner and Grant, the greater battle of reform and accountability would take much more time, effort, and devotion from top to bottom through law enforcement. Once she had left the review board's office, Brianna took a deep breath, the weight of her decision empowering her at once. She knew coming forward made her vulnerable, not just to criticism, but also to that kind of scrutiny that could touch her career. But she walked down the corridor, reminding herself why she did it. This was bigger than her. It was about the principles she'd vowed to uphold when she first took her oath as an FBI agent. In the days following her meeting, the investigation moved forward quickly. Turner and Grant were interviewed again, as were a handful of officers who had been present when the initial report was filed. Grant's reluctant cooperation and frank explanation of what happened gave credence to an investigation. During the process, Turner's attempt to shift blame and minimize involvement didn't go unnoticed by the department. Turner's suspension was then made official, and shortly after, it was announced that he would be reviewed and possibly terminated from the department. Also, Grant's reassignment was made official, and he was demoted to another unit with tight supervision and bias, and de-escalation training was required. The disciplinary board explained that even though Grant's actions were also inexcusable, his admittance of wrongdoing had spared him much worse punishments. Reactions varied in the community, with some praising the department for taking responsibility for the actions of its officers, and others feeling the case was poorly handled, and that Brianna was overreacting. She watched these comments go up online and felt their sting, but she also knew she couldn't let them affect her. This wasn't about popularity or public approval. This was about what was right. As Brianna sat down to think about everything that had happened, she knew it was far from over. She'd fought for accountability, but the journey was nowhere near complete. Her complaint had sparked a number of conversations within the department, challenging other officers to confront biases and assumptions of their own. Brianna knew that true change would take some time to set in. Even so, she felt a sense of hope that one day encounters like this would be very rare or completely unheard of. Over the succeeding weeks, Brianna settled back into her job, but now with a heightened sense of determination. She threw herself into her work and focused on her commitment to justice. This confrontation with Turner and Grant brought home not only how powerful her position was, but also how it came with so much responsibility. She would wake up every day, using that power, not just to enforce the law, but to demand better from the system itself. As she walked out of her office complex that evening, Brianna looked up at the tall glass building of the FBI, partly reflecting the colors of the sun as it began to set. She knew there would be more battles ahead, but she was ready, and she would stand firm, not just for herself, but for all those who couldn't. It was the day of the final disciplinary board at the police precinct. Turner walked up and down the hall outside the chambers of the disciplinary review board, his face dark with frustration and dread. His suspension had lengthened into an investigation, and he was now facing possible termination. The reality of the whole situation felt like a noose tightening around his neck. He clenched his jaw and told himself this was all just another formality. The board would understand he'd been following protocol. But Turner knew the truth. He knew that his violent reaction to Brianna had been a step too far, and the department wasn't just going to look the other way. Grant sat in a chair and silently watched his former partner's agitated composure with a pitiful look. The man standing before him now, filled with resentment and denial, was not the man he thought he had known. Grant had hoped this investigation would make Turner acknowledge his shortcomings, but he only appeared to become more defensive as the pressure built up. The door to the review board's chambers opened, and a member of the board stepped out, gesturing for them to enter. Turner took a deep breath in, squaring his shoulders as he walked into the room, Grant close behind him. They were immediately confronted with the steady, scrutinizing gazes of the board members headed by none other than Captain Howard, who had overseen their case from the beginning. Officers Turner and Grant, Howard began in as firm and unyielding a tone as possible. Thanks for coming in. We have gone over all accounts of what happened, the video footage of the said event, and the statements regarding the incident with Agent Thompson. The investigation has been complete. transparency and fairness have been upheld. Now it's time to present our findings." A knot twisted in Grant's stomach, his hands tensely resting in his lap. He would take whatever was coming his way. He had already accepted his demotion and new assignment with a sense of resignation. But Turner sat rigid, his eyes narrowed, his anger barely contained as he awaited the verdict of the board. Howard looked down at the file in front of him and rose, staring straight at Turner. "Officer Turner, after reviewing all evidence, it is our determination that your actions during the encounter with Agent Thompson were unprofessional and in direct violation of department protocol. Your actions clearly showed a lapse in judgment, a complete diversion of de-escalation techniques, and an unmistakable bias for which this department does not stand." Turner shifted uncomfortably, his mouth pressed into a tight line. He opened his mouth to speak, but Howard raised a hand, silencing him. "Your initial response, your unwillingness to listen to explanations by Agent Thompson, and your insistent efforts to escalate the incident all point to the fact that you conducted yourself in a manner that lacked professionalism and restraint expected of our officers," Howard added calmly, with authority. "We hold ourselves to a higher standard, and we expect our officers to serve the public with respect, fairness, and dignity. Your actions fell short of these expectations." The words fell like blows, and Turner was trying everything to keep the anger in check. He wanted to protest, to argue that he'd been following his instincts, that the initial call from dispatch justified the situation. But he knew that no amount of justification could erase the evidence stacked up against him. The body cam footage, the written reports, Brianna's testimony, all of it painted a picture he couldn't deny. Howard turned to Grant next. "Officer Grant, your actions, while not as overtly aggressive as Turner's, were equally disturbing in complacency. You allowed yourself to get led away from your instincts by your partner. You were complicit, and though you attempted to de-escalate, your failure to act decisively contributed to the incident's escalation." Grant solemnly nodded, agreeing to the captain's judgment. He had come to terms with it, knowing full well that his inaction had cost him his standing in the department. "I understand, Captain," he said calmly. Howard's face softened just a little as he addressed Grant. "You took responsibility and cooperated with the investigation. That says much about your character. But let this be a lesson. Being an officer means having the courage to speak up, even against your partner." Howard turned to face Turner again, his expression hardening. "Officer Turner, by reason of the severity of your actions, it is the finding of the board that you be relieved of your duties with the department immediately. You are to turn in your badge and service weapon before the end of the day." Turner's face was contorted with shock and rage. His mouth opened and closed to say something, to protest, but the words were not coming. His badge, his authority, his career, and all that he had lived for were being taken away from him, and he could not contain his outrage. "This is a mistake," Turner spat in a loud tone. "I dedicate years to serving this department, and you send me away now over one incident because of some kind of misunderstanding?" Howard's gaze did not change. "This was not an easy decision for us to make, Turner. However, your actions put the excellent reputation and integrity built up over time in this department in jeopardy. Your denial of accountability further strengthens this decision we have made." Turner's face flushed with anger, his hands clenching into fists. He flashed a glance at Grant, resentment flickering in the depths of his eyes. "And what about him?" he growled, the words thick with bitterness. "He was there too. He backed me up. Why does he get off with a slap on the wrist?" Howard didn't bat an eye. Grant's cooperation and acceptance of his failures are basic differences in attitude. He accepted responsibility, whereas you have denied it at every turn. Accountability is something this department does not tolerate a lack of. And also, this is the first complaint involving Officer Grant. Turner fixed his glare on the captain. All this, because of some FBI agent. She blew everything out of proportion. I was working in a professional capacity. Howard's face grew even colder as he spoke firmly and resolutely. No, Turner. You were abusing your authority, and now you face your consequences. The finality in Howard's tone was thick in the air as Turner deflated, his shoulders caving inward as the weight of the thought set in. He was done. All he had built, all his time served, his illusion of power, it was all coming to an end. Grant felt an odd sort of relief mixed with regret. He could understand Turner's frustration, even when he disagreed with it. Once they'd been partners, but it was Turner's refusal to look beyond his ego and take responsibility for a change that had shoved them apart to where it could never be fixed. Howard stood, which was a signal that the meeting was over. Turner, you may gather your personal effects from your locker. A supervisor will accompany you to ensure all department property is returned. Turner slowly got to his feet, his face a mask of fury and humiliation. He shot one last venomous look at Grant, his expression a mask of bitter accusation. Saying nothing, he turned and walked out, the sound of his footsteps echoing along the corridor as he walked away from what had once been a loved career. The minute Turner was out the door, Howard turned back to Grant, and his expression loosened. Grant, as I said, this incident will stand in your record, and you will be very closely watched in your new role. I expect you to take this opportunity to restore your reputation and to show that you can live up to the principles required of the personnel here in this department. Grant nodded. Thank you, sir. I'll try to live up to such expectations, I assure you. Howard merely nodded, his face blank. I trust that you will. You are dismissed. As Grant finally left the room, he had this unusual feeling of relief intermingled with some regret. The aftermath of the incident involving Brianna changed the trajectory of his career and changed his thinking forever. He knew it would take some time for his colleagues to accept him back into the fold, but he had been given a second chance, an opportunity to rebuild broken trust, and he wasn't going to let it slip away. Later that afternoon, Grant cleaned his things out from his old desk as his mind replayed the events of the last few weeks. He found himself thinking about how composed and steady Brianna had been during the confrontation, and about how courageous it had been for her to stand up for what was right, even when things were about to get hostile. She had called him out, and in so doing, made him look at his inadequacies. As Grant returned to the officer room, he noticed the difference in the faces of his colleagues. Some refused to meet his gaze, while others stared with curiosity and disdain. He regretted everything that had happened. Yet Grant had a quiet determination to learn from his errors and become the kind of officer he could respect. Meanwhile, Turner sat in his car, clutching the wheel tightly, his face a mask of barely contained rage. He could not believe it. Everything he had given to this department had gone down the drain in an instant, and now he was being cast aside like a useless piece of the puzzle. Turner. He couldn't believe a black woman had made him lose everything he had. His mind was a scattered jumble of resentment and bitterness, but his thoughts riveted on Brianna. She was the reason he had lost everything, the reason his career was over. In his mind, she had ruined him, and he would never forgive her for it. As Turner stared out the windshield, his grip on the steering wheel tightened. Brianna wasn't just one of those factors that had ended his career in his mind. She was the only one. She had taken it all away from him and flipped his life upside down with just a single complaint. Turner couldn't see his own part in what had happened. His mind was clouded by resentment, casting Brianna as the villain in a story of his own making. Turner's thoughts spiraled further. Every moment of his career played out in his mind. The years of service, the sacrifices, the many nights of patrolling the streets and keeping the peace. For nothing, he thought bitterly. It had all come undone by a single complaint, by one woman's accusation that he had lost control. The resentment twisted in his chest, making him bitter and hollow. He wasn't willing to see that this was because of his actions and his refusal to approach the situation with restraint and professionalism. It was as if the department had reached out and slapped him for every good thing he had ever done, for every drop of passion he had put in, every ounce of dedication given. To them, it had meant nothing. To them, it had never mattered. He was cast aside for that mistake, one he could not admit had anything to do with bias instead of simply protocol. Turner uttered a low, bitter chuckle, shaking his head. "After all I have done," he muttered to himself. "Thrown away, just so." But subconsciously, Turner knew that he crossed the line, and instead of taking responsibility, he'd allowed his pride and assumptions to get in the way of his judgment. And now, he was reaping the consequences. After a very long period of silence, Turner turned on the car and began driving randomly through the city, the streets blurring together. He didn't know where he was going, nor did he care. All he could dwell on was this burning sense of betrayal and anger. He had lost his job, badge, and any semblance of authority. For the first time in his life, he was left with nothing but himself to confront. Turner couldn't shake off the weight of what he'd lost while driving, but neither could he bring himself to face the role he'd played in it. Meanwhile, as Turner stewed in his resentment, Brianna was trying to work through her emotions. Over the succeeding days of the disciplinary action against the officers, she found herself wrestling with an unexpected mixture of relief, frustration, and sadness. She had done what was necessary, what was right, but the process had left her emotionally drained. Every encounter, every conversation replayed in her mind, reminders of the brutal reality she had faced and the systemic problems she hoped her complaint might begin to address. Brianna met with her close friend and fellow agent in the FBI, Malik, at a quiet downtown cafe. Malik had been her confidant since their training days at Quantico several years ago. He knew better than most what she faced both professionally and personally as a black female in law enforcement. They sank into a booth at the back of the cafe and talked for a few minutes before Malik turned to her, his eyes serious and inquiring. "So," he said in a low voice, "I heard about Officer Turner and Grant's case. How are you holding up?" Brianna took a deep breath, her hands wrapping around the coffee cup, its warmth anchoring her. "Honestly, I have no idea where to begin. I am relieved, yet it's all so complicated. There is a side of me that wished this would feel like a victory, another step in the right direction. But the truth is, I just feel exhausted." Malik nodded, his face sympathetic. "It's a heavy thing to wear. You did something big, Brianna, did something that took guts. It's understandable if it took a great deal of energy from you." She let out a soft sigh, her gaze flickering out the window to the city lights glowing in a wide band across the night sky. "I think about all those people who don't have the same means, the same badge of protection. The whole time I couldn't get it out of my head that if I didn't have my FBI credentials, things could have turned out so differently. It scares me." Malik reached across the table and laid a reassuring hand on hers. "You're right, and that's precisely why this matters. What Turner and Grant have done speaks to a greater issue, a pattern that doesn't just disappear in a disciplinary review. It is why you filed the complaint in the first place, and it is why it is so important that you stood up. You held them accountable in a way few others could have." Brianna nodded, taking a sip as she took in Malik's words. I know. But that won't change the fact that so many others will never have this chance. Even now, I think about those people whose names we know, whose faces have been plastered on the news, and whose stories we carry with us. Will things ever really change? Malik's face softened, his tone quiet and firm. Bree, you can't hold the weight of the whole system on your shoulders. You're playing your role, and that counts for something. You can't see it now, but that movement is growing steadily. She gave him a small smile, but a part of her still was battling the magnitude of everything that still had to be done in the fight against police misconduct and racial profiling among law enforcers. You're right, but there's this gap between the work we believe in and the work we're actually able to do. Talking to Malik was always so easy, and the more they spoke about several things happening in their life, Brianna felt a little lighter. Over the coming weeks, Brianna focused once again on her work in the FBI. Despite concentrating on her work, Brianna's thoughts were filled with ways she could bring about more accountability and justice among law enforcement workers. Brianna knew she could do nothing about it all by herself, yet, from her position, she could make a difference. A small one, perhaps, but nevertheless a difference. What Turner and Grant had taught her was that change did not come with simply standing up for oneself. It required a constant, concerted commitment to fighting biases and seeking reform. In her attempts to be able to help bring this sort of change, Brianna chose to become more actively involved in initiatives within the FBI that dealt mainly with improving relations between law enforcement and the communities they served. She volunteered to run workshops on bias training and de-escalation, using her own experiences to help others understand the way in which prejudice, so often unconsciously, wrapped itself around judgment. She knew these were only a few small steps, but was confident that the power of awareness would change minds with time. One afternoon, Brianna stood in a room full of agents of every rank and background imaginable. She spoke to the necessity for empathy within the work they did, her voice never faltering. Every day we are in contact with people who had different upbringings and who have lived different lives from our own, she said as her glance swept across the sea of faces. It's so simple to fall into assumptions, to lean on stereotypes rather than seeing the individual. We have, however, the duty to confront our biases, stop, listen, and try to see every person with the respect that they deserve. It is not about protecting ourselves from complaints or litigation. Instead, it has something to do with building trust. And without trust, well, that core that allows us to do our jobs is gone. Brianna watched her words strike a chord as some faces remained in contemplation while others nodded in agreement. It was a warming response, and for Brianna, it rejuvenated a sense of purpose that even the tiniest shift in perspective can sometimes create ripples. As the workshop was winding down, one of the younger recruits approached her with a solemn expression on his face. Agent Thompson, I just wanted to thank you for speaking so openly today. I think a lot of us needed to hear that, coming from someone with your experience in particular. It's eye-opening. Brianna smiled and nodded in acknowledgement. Thanks. It's not an easy conversation, but it's a necessary one. And the more we talk about it, the more we can challenge ourselves to do better. As she gathered up her things to leave, she felt better and more fulfilled. She had witnessed firsthand how standing up for accountability could be so very important, and vowed to continue pushing. Not all injustices could be righted, but one thing she could do was make sure those values she cherished continued to guide her in her work. Later that evening, as she stood out on the office porch, she gazed out across the city and sky as the sun dipped below the skyline. The sense of justice she had always carried had grown deeper and stronger, with the knowledge that her actions, no matter how small, were part of something much greater. As she stepped outside, Brianna's mind went to Officer Turner about his denial of responsibility. She knew too well that this was one powerful profession that would need to bake the values of modesty and respect into a lot of individuals. She wished, over time, that the system could nurture such a culture where accountability wasn't the exception but the rule. As night blanketed the city, Brianna headed home with a firm resolution to do everything in her power to uphold accountability in any situation she found herself in. She could not change the world overnight, but at least she would continue to live by those values that were part of her, every small act of courage and integrity contributing somehow to a future she could believe in.